now that we're recording.
Okay.
Should make sure that it's actually coming through for the recording. Yes, it is. So hi and welcome everyone who's going to get to watch this recording. We're redoing most of the webinar from yesterday because yours truly forgot to hit the record button. We're using brand new software, and I did not realize that that was separate and distinct from the start webinar button. So it is, and here we are redoing things for your viewing pleasure. So with me is Adam Montague, our support guy, and I'm Shane Bishop, the founder of UIO. And so, yeah, let's get right into it. The first thing we cover is talking about some advanced features, and I'll switch back to easy mode so we can see how to get there. But talking about folders to optimize, scheduled optimization, and some things with bulk optimization and what all that covers. So normally when you install UImage Optimizer and run a bulk optimize, it's going to automatically optimize stuff that's in the media library. New uploads will be done, of course, automatically. If you want to do all your existing stuff, you go over to media and hit the bulk optimize. Now, all the images that are in my media library have already been optimized because I had the plugin active before I uploaded them. And it will also scan a few other folders: BuddyPress, WP Symposium, your active theme. And then, of course, it will also optimize other folders that you specify. But why would you need to do that? So if a plugin is not using the normal WordPress upload process, and it's not going, images aren't going into the media library, there's a good chance that we need to tell our plugin specifically where those images are being uploaded to, so that it can optimize them either with the bulk optimize or the scheduled optimizer. And so there's a few gallery plugins are an example of something that would fall into this category. Forms plugins will often not upload, if a user is submitting an image or a file along with their form, those usually don't go into the media library. Some form plugins will have an option to add those into the media library, but typically by default they're not. And some galleries, we looked at Foo Gallery, Envira Gallery, those both send their uploads into the media library. And so they're covered by the normal WordPress hooks, and UImage Optimizer will automatically upload that, and everything's awesome. Mm-hmm. Next Gen Gallery and FLA Gallery are two galleries that do not use that normal media library process, but we have custom integrations for both of those because they're a couple of the larger ones that have been around forever and ever, since the early days of, since before UImage Optimizer even existed 9 years ago. But one photo gallery that doesn't do the normal process and that we don't have a direct integration for is just called Photo Gallery. And it's the Photo Gallery by 10Web. 10Web.io is the team that created it. And so we're going to take a look at that to show you some of these things with folders to optimize and scheduled optimization. So I've already created a test gallery in here, uploaded a bunch of images, and so here they all are. And if we go to run the bulk optimize, we tell it to scan, and it goes, there's nothing to optimize. Well, that's not right, because our gallery hasn't been optimized. And how do we know that? We go to Tools, UImage Optimizer, and we tell it to show our optimized images. And here we have our theme images. We've got stuff from the media library, but it hasn't optimized our stuff in the photo gallery. And so to get those optimized, those images in the gallery, the first thing we got to do to get to these settings is we enable ludicrous mode. And that's a little bit of a shout out to the Spaceballs movie, if you've ever seen that. If you haven't, it's a funny old classic movie. And yeah, it's pretty funny. Anyway, you go into ludicrous mode, hit the advanced tab, and here's the options that we're talking about. Scheduled optimization, which will run every hour and check for new images in your theme folder and any of these other folders that normally it would check. Normally, scheduled optimization doesn't do anything with the media library because all that stuff is taken care of automatically during upload. But if you have something like a theme that is creating extra thumbnails without using the normal WordPress stuff, so it's not putting it in the database and it's not using the standard method of telling WordPress, hey, I need this size and that size and the other size. It's not doing that and just doing its own thing to create thumbnails. You might need this, and this will then go through. And for example, we're in November, so this would scan the 2021/11 and the 2021/10 folders, the last 2 months of uploads, and it would check for images that haven't been optimized in those folders. If this is your first time using EU Image Optimizer and you've got a bunch of those images already beyond the last 2 months, you would want to do something like, put in your root folder here, which is this guy right here. This is the root of our WordPress install. You're just going to look different, so you just use that, and then typically, unless you've changed your upload folder, it'll be something like this. And that would then allow the bulk optimizer to go through and scan the entire uploads folder, not just looking at what's in the database and what WordPress knows about, but also scanning the entire folder, doing a low-level scan to see if there's other images in there that have been missed. So saving that would allow the bulk optimizer to scan that folder. We're not going to do that because we're not in that case. The place that we're in is that we need to get those photo gallery images optimized. And how do we do that? How do we find out what folder they're in? Well, we go over to the photo gallery and we go to our gallery and we right click on one of these images and open in a new tab. And this right here is what we're looking for. WP content /upload/photo gallery. Hey, that's the folder where they live. So we go back over to our folders to optimize setting. Type in that root portion there. Double up our slashes and then add the extra part there. And remember that this is a file system path, so it's different than what we see here with the domain, where this is a URL. So the URL is going to be different than the actual file system path.
If you had just put the uploads folder, would that have grabbed this folder as well?
It does not. You do need to type in that whole path in there.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Let's test that out. We tested something else out yesterday. I don't remember what. But
we also talked about whether or not we need the preceding and following forward slashes on
and you
there.
don't need the trailing slash, but you do need the one at the beginning. So I'm just going to see what it does if I add that. I might have actually built something in that would go in and, yeah, look at that. So that can save you some typing. So if you just put in the relative path, this guy, it'll try to put in the absolute path in front of that and see if that's a valid folder. And if it is, it goes, oh, yep, that's what they meant to do. And so off you go. Look at that. I created something that I forgot about. All right. Cool. So that is what we need to get those images optimized. Then we go over to our bulk optimize screen. And we're going to scan again. Last time we got nothing. This time, wait for it. Hey, we got 34 images. So now let's go ahead and optimize those. And off it goes. And here it's going and optimizing the stuff in our photo gallery folder. So while it's doing that, let's go ahead and talk about scheduled optimization and why and when you would need that. And so the first thing I want to mention is that you don't want to enable scheduled optimization while you're still running a bulk optimize. And I would always recommend running a bulk optimize before you enable scheduled optimization. You could probably get away with doing scheduled optimization, but for huge numbers of images, the bulk optimizer is typically more reliable. The scheduled optimizer is pretty good anymore, but it just helps to be able to, look at it and go, hey, yeah, it's doing what it's supposed to do, and then you know when it finished, and you don't have to think about waiting for it or figuring out, is it done yet? Is it done yet? You can just go back to the bulk optimizer and see if it's done. So yeah, you can't have the two run at the same time because they're running from the same queue. That's the main reason you can't do them at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then when would we need it? So if new images, so sometimes you have a plugin where you need this folders to optimize to get all the old stuff, but new stuff is automatically optimized. I can't think of a plugin like that off the top of my head, but there are plugins out there where that is the case. But if they're not being optimized during upload, like with this photo gallery, now it's finished, so we can go over and add a new image to see, hey, are new uploads being optimized? We know that the existing stuff wasn't, but what about a brand new image? And so we'll go over here and let's try not to upload the same exact image that I did the other day. Let's see. I think I did that one. Yep, I did all those. So we're going to grab a little bit bigger one. So we got to go to upload and add an image. So it might take a tish longer. Oh, not too bad. And off that goes. So we're going to add that into our gallery and update our gallery.
There it is.
And so now how in the world do we know? And again, we're going to go over to Tools, Image Optimizer, where we have all these other things, but the main one, again, that we're looking at is Show Optimized Images. Did it optimize that image? And no, it didn't. So in this sort of case, that's when we say, okay, let's do scheduled optimization, which will scan, all those extra folders, the theme, BuddyPress, WP Symposium, all those others, as well as if we've turned this on, it'll scan those, and it will scan anything that we put down in this box every hour. And so that will go off and do its thing. It won't start right away. It'll wait for about an hour before it kicks off that first deal. It is dependent on WP cron, so if you're using scheduled optimization, make sure that you've got a reliable WP cron setup, which means one of two things. Either you have enough traffic that WP cron is being triggered automatically, because that's the only way that it's triggered by default. WordPress doesn't have any magical internal timer that just keeps running, goes, oh, yep, it's time, 5 minutes later, let's run this. It's 10 minutes later, let's run that. It checks those times, but it only checks those times when someone is visiting your site. So that's important to know. If you're on there's certain web hosts that will run WP cron via an actual system level cron on the system, so it's a scheduled task independent of WordPress that will run consistently when it's supposed to. And that's typically a lot more reliable. So if your web host has something like that, definitely take advantage of it, because that will make sure that the scheduled optimization runs every hour without fail. There was something else I was going to mention there. Lost it. So maybe it'll come back to me. And we can, of course, go over here and see if it, ran that one yet. No, it didn't. So like I said, it's probably going to take about an hour before it'll run that image through and optimize it. And on this site, because it's a demo site and not getting any traffic, that will never happen. So there are tools like WP Control is a plugin that will let you go in and see what scheduled tasks you have. And you can trigger them manually then if you needed to. Of course, if you're doing it manually, you might as well just run the bulk optimizer, but that plugin can be super helpful to see what all you have running for scheduled tasks on your website. I did want to mention this site is run on a platform called TasteWP. It's tastewp.com, and they let you set up basically throwaway sites that expire after 3 or 7 days, depending on if you create an account with them. Super simple, and you don't have to have an account. You can, fire up a site that'll last you for 3 days and play around with plugins, play around with themes, play around with whatever you want. And it's a really easy way to kind of have a sandbox environment where you can mess around and not blow up your real site while you're trying things out. So that's tastewp.com, and yeah, pretty slick.
It's very cool.
All right, did I miss anything with that you can think of?
I don't think so. I'm trying to remember all of the things that we went through. The only, I think,
We had some questions connected to that had come up, I know.
Well, so one of the questions was, if resize is turned on, would it resize the images in the gallery folder as well?
And so the answer to that was no. By default, it will not. And so to fix that, we go over to our UImage Optimizer settings, and we go over the resize tab. So we got these dimensions set, this 1920 by 1920, and if we want those gallery images to be resized to 1920 by 1920 as well, we have to check this resize other images. So this lets the scheduled and bulk optimizers also scale down the images that aren't in the media library. We don't do that by default because sometimes those other plugins might have their own resizing, and it's not necessary to go in and resize them. Otherwise, you might have wanted them to be bigger. So you had this set to 1920, but your gallery, you want it to be 3000 or something because you want it, want people to be able to see a little bit larger, higher quality versions, or whatever the case might be. I did notice, I hadn't seen this yesterday, but with this photo gallery, it looked like the default is that they scale the images down to 1200 by 1200, unless you change that. So of course you can change that, but that's their default for this particular gallery. And then another question that was connected to the bulk optimizer was on a server with lower memory or possibly even CPU constraints, are there any performance tips to keep resource use low when using scheduled optimization? I guess that was specific to scheduled, but the same option kind of applies to both. And so what we recommend is one of our overrides. So known as constants, if you're familiar with PHP constants. And so this would be something that you would add to your wp-config.php file. If you're not sure what in the world that means, just shoot us an email and we can help you, or your web host can help you get that put in there. But this is the actual option that we would recommend. That's why it's at the top, because it's kind of one of those most requested things. So in the bulk optimizer, if you notice, there was a setting that lets you, set a delay 1 second, 5 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever you want it to be in between images. Well, the scheduled optimizer by default will do things in batches. So it's going to do as many images as it can in 15 to 20 seconds, and then it kind of respawns itself. And that's how it's able to keep going without running into PHP timeouts and that sort of thing. But if you don't want it to do images, one right after the other, you can set this delay. Like, again, you can set it to whatever amount of time you want. Generally don't really recommend going much higher than 10 or 15 seconds. And worth noting as well that this really applies more. It can be useful even if you're using the compress API, but it's less useful in that case. But it's really useful if you're using the free mode, because our plugin is a little unique in that scenario where the free mode does all the compression right on your server, whereas most other plugins, everything is done on third-party servers. But with our plugin, that's only the case if you're using our API. So this is especially important if you're on a shared hosting server and you're running in free mode. Definitely be kind to your web server and don't blow up all the other 500 sites that are on your web server by running scheduled optimize with a ton of images every hour. That wouldn't be very nice. So the scheduled optimizer itself and the bulk optimize processes, we've optimized them to run in a pretty low amount of memory. I've run them before in like 16 megs of memory with WordPress and all that. And so it's capable of running in a pretty small amount of memory, and that's on a site with 40,000 images. So it'll break things down into smaller chunks if it needs to make sure that it's staying efficient and not using up too much memory. Might take a little longer, but it'll at least still run. And then had Todd, who wasn't able to make it to the webinar, had asked for a comparison between our plugins and WP Smush Pro and Hummingbird Pro. But before I get to that, I wanted to touch on something that Elliot had asked yesterday, and that was talking about local development in relation to both the Compress API and our EasyIO CDN. So the Compress API is what is used by the bulk optimizer if you're using premium to compress the images directly on your server. The EasyIO CDN makes copies of your images and optimizes them on the CDN, so it's not messing with your local images. And so those have kind of different scenarios when it comes to how that works with a local dev environment when you're running it, say on your desktop or laptop just as a testing site before you make changes in production and whatnot. So with the Compress API, all of that stuff works just fine for local development. There are plugins that have a hard time getting to your images, when they're not publicly accessible. But the bulk optimizer does not have that issue. EasyIO, on the other hand, does have that issue because it's a CDN and it's a pull mode CDN. It needs to be able to access your images to deliver them to your users. Even for testing, it's got to have that. That's just the way a CDN works. It's the way EasyIO works, therefore. So there's not too many ways really to work around that. The only way that we could think of would be if you would offload your media on that local site to something like S3. And then you could have EasyIO pointed at an Amazon S3 bucket and grabbing the images from there, because then they're publicly accessible. So that would allow you to keep the site itself local, private, but then your images are able to be optimized, and you can kind of see what that looks like with EasyIO. Of course, TasteWP would not be a horrible option to kind of mess around with EasyIO and see how that all works. You could upload a bunch of images and do whatever you want there. Try out EasyIO on that demo site and just see what it does. But if you really wanted to do it on a local site, S3 would be a decent option. as a workaround. All right, so Hummingbird Pro and WP Smush Pro. A lot of people have seen those, especially because Smush is one of the most popular WordPress plugins for image optimization. It was bought by WP Mood Dev ages ago from the guy that originally built the Smush plugin. And so then they launched a pro service around that, and then now they've got a whole bunch of plugins. But Hummingbird Pro and Smush Pro are two of theirs that are specifically geared for performance. So of course we have our image optimizer that we've been talking about, but we also have a newer plugin that's been out for about a year called SWIS Performance, and that's what we'll be comparing here in most cases to what the features that Hummingbird Pro has. And so I was able to find, at first I thought I was going to have to actually go and install it, but I ran out of time for that. And then I found that in their FAQ, they have this handy dandy breakdown with a little more detail on all the different features and what's included in Hummingbird Pro. And so we'll just take them one by one. Generate performance reports. That is something that we do with EasyIO. So when you register a site, on the EasyIO CDN, we generate a before report with GT metrics. And then after you activate EasyIO on your site, we generate an after snapshot. Sometimes page caching can get in the way there. And so we send you an email with those results automatically once they're done. And if page caching was not cleared, of course, then you'll need to rerun the performance report to get a feel for what it actually looks like with the EasyIO. But we do run that. This is just generic text, I think, that they use here for filler, because it really doesn't tell you anything about what the plugin does. Browser caching is something that we do in SWIS, so we set that up for you automatically. SWIS also has a full page cache. We don't do Gravatar caching, which I believe is mostly really a privacy thing rather than a performance thing, because the Gravatar CDN should be pretty fast, just as fast as any CDN that you might have on your site. So that really shouldn't be an issue performance-wise. We don't do RSS caching, but if that's something that you think would just be the awesomest thing ever, we have a feature request site over at feedback.EWWW IO, and you can vote on other things that people have suggested there, as well as, of course, suggest your own ideas or suggest things like RSS caching if you would love to see that in the SWIS Performance plugin. Minifying files like JavaScript and CSS is something that we do both with EasyIO and SWIS. Since EasyIO is a CDN, we can send all your JavaScript and CSS through that CDN and automatically minify them on the fly. So that's something we've done for quite a while with that. Google font optimization is something that we also do with SWIS. And there's some quirks there with the way that Google's got Google font stuff set up, where it uses two different domains to one for the CSS and then one for the actual fonts. And so that ends up creating an extra HTTP request. It ends up creating an extra DNS lookup, and really kind of, it's just unnecessary and wasteful. So what we do is we inline that CSS, so that way you're not making an HTTP request for it, and there's no DNS lookup necessary, and then it can just go out and grab the fonts, and everything's happy. There are some, kind of like the Gravatar idea, there's some privacy concerns with that still for some people, where they don't want, to be sending people to, or the browser. They're not really sending people there, but they don't want to have the browser going out and fetching the fonts from Google servers. They want it all on their site. So we do have a feature request for that already on the feedback site. So if that's something you want, vote for that. Can you hear that vacuum in the background?
Just barely.
Okay. Just wanted to double check.
Yeah, it's a little bit
about to drive me crazy, but if no one else can hear it, we'll just keep on trucking on.
It's adding a little noise, but I think it'll be okay.
All right. So combine files is not something that we do or recommend. It's something that has been dropped from a lot of recommendation sites, and it's something that even plugins like WP Rocket tell you isn't really recommended, notably because of advancements in the HTTP protocol. HTTP 2, which has been out for, I don't even know how many years now, 5, 6, something like that at least. It used to be when you would have, say, 10, 15, CSS files on your site, that the browser would have to, it could only have a certain number of connections, and it couldn't load those in parallel. And so you got that many files, so it's going to have to do those, 3, 4 at a time, and then it takes a lot longer to download those. But with HTTP 2 and 3 now, that's not really an issue because now they can be downloaded in parallel. I mean, you can download like 20, 30 files in parallel, and it's not a big deal anymore. The problem then with combining files, because otherwise you say, well, it's not causing any problems, right? Well, right. But it is. And most notably, it causes issues with browser caching, which is one of the big things that we're trying to help solve, right? Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that when you have that combined file, if you have, say, 20 CSS files on one page and 25 on another page and 23 on yet another page, which is very common because developers should be only loading their CSS when they need it, then you end up with 3 different really big combined CSS files. And when you visit each of those 3 pages, the browser has to download that entire CSS package. But if you kept them separate, you can then, you load 20 on the first page and you go to the second page with 25, and then the browser only has to download 5 of those because it already cached the other 20. Mm-hmm. And likewise, you go to the page that's got 23 and say, only one of those is new. Well, then it only has to load 1 CSS file, and that's really awesome. But if you combine those, you completely eliminate that advantage of browser caching and make it pretty much pointless. So really, the only thing that could be cached would be fonts and images if you combined and merged your JavaScript and CSS. Mm-hmm. Database cleanup is something we try very hard not to mess with. We don't like to mess with your database very much. But there are some potential things that we might look into there. We've got feature requests for them, notably things like transient cleanup, expired transient cleanup. And so what in the world is a transient? A transient is basically a temporary value put in your WP options table. So it's like a temporary option used by different plugins or themes for temporary use, and they're supposed to expire, right? So that WordPress puts a timestamp on them in the database, but it doesn't clean them up unless they're requested again. So if a plugin creates, say, 10 transients and only asks for 3 of them ever again, you got 7 of them stuck in the database that are never expired and never purged from the database. Well, after years and years of use and having multiple plugins and possibly installing and reinstalling and uninstalling different plugins, because that just happens over the lifetime of a website, you might have a lot of bloat from those transients. Mm. And then that will cause the queries to the WP options table that happen on every single page load. It'll make those slower because it's got to look through more stuff. Especially, and I've never seen something quite this bad, but I could imagine where you could get a site with, 10 to 20,000 transients stuck in the database, or at the very least, you might have 10 to 20,000 options stuck in the database. And so it can be helpful to clean up those transients and make the queries a little bit faster again. So that's something that's on the feedback site. If you think that's an awesome idea, it's not usually a huge issue, like I said, unless you've had a site that's been around for a long time or you've got some plugins that are really out of control with transients. Generally, 10 to 20,000 options is pretty extreme. but theoretically possible. Cloudflare APO and browser caching. That's something we tried not, well, specifically the Cloudflare stuff, and kind of same deal for, say, like Lightspeed caching or any other third-party cache system. They already have plugins built specifically for their platform, and they put a lot of work into those, and there's just no way that we're going to keep up with that feature set. So really the best solution in those cases is to use the official plugins for those caching systems. And of course, in some cases, like my mind just went blank, but with some of the third-party caches, some of the free or open source type of ones, there's not necessarily an official plugin, but there are well-maintained plugins out there for managing those caches. And honestly, those are a lot better option than us trying to, implement 100 features that another plugin has already done and done well. So that's my stand on that. So specifically for Cloudflare, that is not likely to be something that we'll tackle. APO makes a little more sense, but we have had people request just the ability to purge the entire Cloudflare cache, which is something we don't even recommend for our CDN, let alone for Cloudflare, because then the CDN has to go and fetch all of your assets again, and that slows everything down. So really, we try not to clear a CDN cache if we can help it at all. And that leads into this next option, which is to remove query strings. Back in the day, 10 years or more ago, there were proxy servers, notably Squid was a popular proxy server, still is probably a popular reverse proxy server. Or no, it's not a reverse proxy, it's an actual proxy server. That's not important, but it had issues with caching assets like images that had query strings or JavaScript or CSS files. Well, that was years ago and was fixed years and years, over 10 years ago. I think it's 11 years now, almost. So that's really not a thing anymore. And the problem with it is that these URL query strings are exactly what we use and what WordPress uses and what most plugins use to invalidate JavaScript and CSS on the CDN cache, so that you don't have to purge the entire CDN cache by adding a query string like a version number or a modification time that automatically tells the CDN, oh, this is a brand new file. It's not the same one that you've already got, so treat it as a new one. It goes and fetches it from your site again, fetches the latest copy, and then delivers that one going forward for your visitors. So you don't want to remove those query strings. It's a really bad idea. And yeah, it's been removed from every speed testing site, or should be if it's not already, but all the good ones have removed it already. And yeah, and I believe WP Rocket already removed that option. We never had it to start with because, yeah, it doesn't work with our stuff, and it's a bad idea. Set load position isn't something we mess with currently. That would be doing something like moving JavaScript from the head of the HTML into the footer. And that was typically something that people would do to prevent JavaScript from being render blocking. So you move it basically to the footer of the page code, so that way all the stuff above that can be rendered, and then the JavaScript runs afterwards. Well, now we've got better options like deferring JavaScript, and so we use that method instead of trying to mess with the load position and breaking things horribly. We also, in Swiss, have gzip, automatic gzip configuration. You just install the plugin and it's done. Advanced asset optimization controls. I'm not 100% sure what that is, and no one in the webinar knew for sure what that is, but it sounds a lot like one of the features in Swiss, which we call Slim, and it's a dealio that lets you see all the JavaScript and CSS on your pages, and it lets you disable them or customize them as you need to. So as an example, on our site, it's this little guy right up here. When you're on the front end of your site, you click the Swiss button, or you click that manage JavaScript CSS item, and it shows you, like I said, it shows you all the stuff that's loading on your site, shows you how big those files are, and gives you some handy information like dependencies and all that, so you can try not to break your site. And with any of these, if you make any changes in here, you add a rule to disable a particular CSS file or JavaScript file. Make sure you test out your site every change you make. Don't go making 5-6 changes and then your site's broken. You go, crap, which one? Which one broke it? Change it after, or test your site after every change. And so here's an example. Besides our theme that's kind of inefficient, our pricing tables plugin I just found out recently is loading a whole pile of CSS everywhere, and so I disabled a bunch of them. I still have more work to do on this, but as an example, they have multiple layouts that are available for the pricing tables, and we're only using layout 5. Well, then we don't need layout 4 and 6 and 7 and all these others. We only need 5, and so you can see that this is the only one that we've left enabled. And so as an example of how this works, I'll just show you real quick. Let's delete this rule for layout 6, and that would then allow the CSS for layout 6 to load on all our pages. If we used, say on this page, if we were using layout 6 here but nowhere else, we could say, okay, we'll disable everywhere except this page. But in our case, we're not using layout 6 anywhere, so we disable it everywhere. We add the rule, and boom, it's done. You can also customize these rules. So here it's disabled. We could say, hey, we want to disable it everywhere except the home page, which is the /. That's what that means. That's at the root of the site. Or we could disable it just on this site, or just on this page. Say we're using the pricing tables on every page except for our home page. That would be the sort of deal that we would need there. And of course, we can select multiple pages. So if it's not literally every page except this, we can say, well, we need it disabled on the home page, we need it disabled on our blog archive, and we need it disabled on our contact form. Say, those would be 3 examples of pages we might do. But this one we actually do use, so I'm not going to mess with that, and we'll just leave it alone. So that's what Slim does, and I'm guessing that's similar to what they have for advanced asset optimization controls. When I was building Slim, I didn't see any other tools that were quite as flexible as what I wanted, and so that has been built into Slim to really make it flexible so that you can fine-tune those controls exactly the way you need them to be. There's still more things we're going to be adding to that, notably the ability to delay JavaScript and to defer JavaScript based on those controls. Right now, it's kind of an all or nothing on the defer, although we do let you set exceptions, of course, to pretty much all of the optimizations in Slim, or in Swiss, I should say. So that ability is there, but to give you a little more fine-grained control, that's something we're going to be adding into Slim in the future. They do have this nifty, we talked about deferring assets, and we do that as well. We don't inline assets for the same reason that we don't combine files, because then it merges things together and prevents the browser from caching things that it could cache. Then bloats your HTML and makes that uncacheable by the browser. Uptime monitor. We use nodeping.com for all of our internal uptime monitoring, so I think that's a great option. There's lots of different uptime monitoring services out there. Some of them are even free. But yeah, so at this point, we're not doing uptime monitors. We're not monitoring your slow load or anything like that. If that's something that you'd like to see, I guess, submit a feedback request, and we'll see how many people are interested in that. Might be something that we provide, or it might be something where we'd integrate with another service, or maybe even with NodePing. But yeah, well, that's something you'd like to see. Uptime monitor, I'm not a huge fan of integrating that with our services, but I could see where you'd want to keep tabs on making sure your site's responding quickly enough. And that's really what that would mostly be, is checking your TTFB, your time to first byte, making sure your server's responding quick enough and not going off in left field and getting overloaded, like it can happen on shared hosting. You might start out there and you got 5 sites on it because you were lucky and were one of the first 5 customers on that server, and then a year later you got 300 or 500 sites that are all on that same server, and it can get bogged down. So especially on shared hosting, that can be important to keep tabs on. Well, heck, on managed hosting even, you want to make sure that your web host isn't, that you're getting what you paid for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are, like I said, there's other ways of monitoring that, but if that's something you'd like to see us do, send us a feedback request on the feedback site. In tracking average paid speed, we don't run scheduled reports at this point because that would be pretty expensive, really expensive, partially because we run it through GT Metrics. Some of these, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing WP MooDev probably built their own so that they're able to manage costs a little better that way.
Mm-hmm.
But we like to use GT Metrics because it's one of the industry standard tests, and that way we're not having to constantly work on building that too, in addition to making your site faster.
Yeah.
Optimize WooCommerce cart fragments. If that's what I think it is, there's a way to do that without a plugin. But if that's something you like to see in Swiss, again, submit a feedback request. We do have the ability to control emojis as part of Slim, that asset kind of control thingy. And then for applying settings to sites in bulk, we don't have that ability, but we do have a feature request, again, for importing and exporting settings. And so, once more, if that's something you'd like to see, feedback.EWWW.IO, and go vote for those features or any of the others that you see that you go, oh, that would be awesome. I would love to have that. We definitely value your feedback. Doesn't necessarily mean that the ones with the top votes are going to get implemented first, but that does make a big difference in our decision-making process. So,
Yep.
Yeah, so that's Hummingbird Pro. Smush Pro, we'll talk briefly about that, but the short version is that it's not as good. Couple notable reasons. Let's just go down the list, but the first and foremost is the amount of compression they're able to achieve. And this 2x compression is pretty well in line with what I've seen when I've tested their service, even though it's been a while. Lossless compression is generally going to be 5 to 10%. And so the fact that they're saying 2x means they're not getting more than 20 to 25% savings on your images. And that's pretty close to what I've seen with them. Whereas any of the good plugins, and ours specifically, are getting around 50 to 60% compression without any visible quality loss. And so that's generally your target that you're looking for. And of course, that can vary from image to image quite a bit. I mean, some images you only get 5% off, and you're like, oh man. And then some images you get 80. So it really depends on the content of the image. So it does vary significantly. But average for us is 50% across all the millions of images that we optimize. CDN bandwidth, we give you 200 to start with. And then we have plans that are 400 and 800 gigs. They only give you 10 to start with. So, I mean, it might be enough for a really tiny site. But yeah, if you got an image heavy site, that's probably not going to cut it. And you're going to be having to pay extra for CDN bandwidth as well. And that's honestly, I think that's on the lower end of what anyone offers as far as CDN bandwidth for image optimization. We also have the ability to back up your original images. It's optional, but that's something that you can do with our API. Unlimited bulk smush is something we give everyone, even the free users. Automatic resize and scale, kind of the same deal. We do have a more enhanced auto scaling engine that works with the EasyIO CDN. So as an example, kind of a side note, but our lazy loader, if your images already have source set or responsive markup, which is the default in WordPress, our lazy loader will tell the browser which of the existing thumbnails to use. When you add EasyIO on top of that, it checks to make sure there's no gaps in between those existing thumbnails and adds in any that might be missing. And then also, so it does that, and then that allows the browser to make an even better decision on what image should be used based on the screen size and the size of the actual image on the page. So that's something that EasyIO makes even better.
Mm-hmm.
And then optimize huge photos up to 32 megs. Well, yeah, those are big images, but we go even bigger. Our actual cap is set at 150 megs, and that's just so that we don't have jokers trying to do stupid things on our API and abuse the service. We've tested images up to 94 megs for JPEGs. We have a whole docs article on the different thresholds that we've tested for various image formats. But yeah, that's Smush in a nutshell compared to our plugins. Their free one doesn't even hold a candle to anything. Honestly, it's pretty weak. But yeah, that's the image optimization side of things. Yeah.
Very cool.
So I think that was pretty much all that we covered yesterday.
So. Yep, I believe so.
It took about the same amount of time. Alrighty. So have a great day, everyone. Happy optimizing. And if you have any other questions, shoot them to support@EWWW.IO. And there's that address right there for you. Boom.
Yeah. And if you want, if you have any questions or any things you'd like for us to cover in any of these videos or like topics, again, send over an email. Let us know.
Yep. Absolutely. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and stop.
All right.